last contributor of the day, last but not least, as the saying goes. That's Professor Sajjad Rizvi of the University of Exeter. Sajjad is the director of the Center for the Study of Islam, and he works on Islamic history and particularly the wilder Persian world. He has written books on Avicenna, on Mullah Sadra, and he is today his research is concentrating more and more on a decolonial and a reparative study of Islam. Today, Sajjad who is also an expert on time in Islam and specifically in Iranian Islam, is going to talk to us about time and being, conceptions of time and ontology in some Islamic thinkers. So Sajjad, welcome aboard.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you everyone for sticking with this. And I'm very grateful to the previous speakers. I apologize, I wasn't here for most of it. I had to pop in and out, not least because many themes that I would like to touch on have already been raised. So, we've already talked about time as an aspect of the human soul. We've already mentioned this classic questions of, whether time is real or unreal. We've talked about the relationship between the concept of the indivisible now, or sometimes even the flowing now. And we've also, I think, raised quite an important issue of whether discussions of time are appropriate perhaps to the analysis of physics, or whether it's really a metaphysical kind of notion. What I want to do is I'll start with a couple of perhaps caveats and then discuss some conceptions of time in the history of kind of later Islamic thought from around, say, the 12th century onwards. So if I start with the caveats, or other perhaps points which are worth raising at the beginning. One is, certainly in the work I've done in the past, discussing time in Islamic thought is rarely done in isolation from discussions of cosmogony and creation. And in fact, what I really appreciated from the previous talk was precisely how you could actually posit some of the philosophy of physics with respect to time within this frame, which is understandable to me as this question of creation, or how the cosmos comes about, and how it, in a sense, flows in an inexorably intimate relationship with time. Related to that, of course, is this other idea, I think, that time is very rarely, in most of the sort of texts that I look at, discussed as a topic in and of itself. So it's usually discussed with respect to something which I know you'll be talking about tomorrow, which is space. So time and space are usually discussed together. Time and motion, of course, very significantly is discussed together, particularly in the Aristotelian tradition. And also, of course, time and bodies, sort of time as a feature of natural bodies. But perhaps the second caveat that I want to raise right at the beginning, which might be kind of an entirely left field observation because it hasn't come up, and it links into what Mike said earlier about my decolonial interests, is that another very important aspect as a historian, which is worth pointing out, is that time is usually associated with history, and especially nowadays, I think, with ideas around modernity, development, progress. So when we talk about time and the flow of time, we often have in mind this idea of the arrow of time and the arrow of progress, which relates to the emergence and development of modernity. And that in itself posits a concept of time which arguably, within the multiple conceptions of time that were discussed earlier, is a deeply colonialist conception of time. So when we talk about time as progress, we assume certain things about development. We assume certain things about a Eurocentric frame of looking at the cosmos and how the cosmos develops. And it then begs the question of what do we do about other cultures in which time is not seen in a linear manner? How do we deal with, for example, cyclical notions of time? How do we deal with far more complicated ideas, as was just recently mentioned, about issues around causality and simultaneity? So I think it is worth raising this question of how time in itself is a problematic concept when we place it alongside notions around modernity and progress. I should also say that there is, when we look at the history of thought in Islam, and particularly with the modern period, there are very different kinds of problems which arise. And I'll just quickly mention two kinds of developments in the modern period before I move back to the classical. Precisely because some of those modern problems of time are not related to this question of time and creation. And precisely because they're much more focused on the individual, on time as a feature of the person. So the two examples I can think of here, which take us in different directions. One is Muhammad Iqbal, the 20th century Indian Muslim thinker, who's heavily influenced by Bergson, and particularly by ideas around how time relates to duration and evolution. So in some ways, he is, I would say, very much struck by a certain idea of time with respect to progress. And the other one is the way in which notions of time are directly associated with different levels of being, ultimately influenced by Heidegger, but then expressed in a whole range of Muslim thinkers in the modern period, such as Abdurrahman Badawi and others, where then time becomes an issue of how do we deal with different conceptions of time which is associated with different levels of ontology. And I'll come back to this question of time and different levels of time and different levels of ontology in the classical period. So I just thought it might be useful just to throw some of these left field thoughts out at the beginning, because it's something that we haven't discussed yet, and also because sometimes what does tend to happen in the history of philosophy or the history of thought in the Islamic context is that we somehow assume that thought stops at some particular point in the past, and is not really taken up in any productive or interestingly creative manners. So coming...
Sajjad, you were frozen for a couple of moments, but we didn't hear you.
Oh, I think my connection might have gone. Can you hear me now again?
Now we can, yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. It's it should be okay. I'm in the office and I'm Etherneted up, so
it might be your connection, Mike, actually.
That could be. I'm sorry, I'm mistaken.
Okay, so let me then what I will do is let me say a couple of things, starting with Avicenna, and then I'll move to a Sufi conception, one of the Sufi conceptions of how we might see time, briefly mention some Ismaili conceptions, and then I'll end up with kind of my guy, Mullah Sadr in the 17th century in Iran. As I said, I'm throwing out these various conceptions partly to make the links with the previous talks, and then hopefully that will lead to a more productive discussion. And also, I do apologize, I haven't been able to get my act together and put together a PowerPoint so that it might be easier to follow perhaps some of the text and the sequence of names which I might be throwing at you. So coming back to this issue of conceptions of time and ontology, there is a particular passage in the work of Avicenna, the famous 11th century philosopher, which is repeated in a couple of other places, which I think are important to as they develop a certain hierarchy of time and being, which is certainly for those of you who know the Neoplatonic tradition well, should be quite familiar. And so it's this particular passage. It comes from a late work called the Ta'liqat, and the Ta'liqat is a set of responses to students who asked him questions about his major work, the healing, the Shifa. And it's interesting because it in a sense presents what we might almost call a phenomenological approach, because it's about how it's not about presenting perhaps a mind independent way of seeing these levels of ontology, but actually saying this is how the mind sees it, i.e. this is how the human mind sees it. So this is what he says. The intellect mind grasps three types of entities. The first is in time and expressed by when, and it describes mutable things that have a beginning and an end. With the proviso, of course, that the beginning is not its end, but it necessitates it. So there's an idea of a sequence there. In this kind of level, things are in permanent flux, constantly changing, and are in states which are in constant renewal. So that's his broad conception of time as we experience it in everyday manner, in sort of the change we see around ourselves in sequences as we might observe. The second is a level of ontology which is with time, and this is called perpetuity. So this, of course, is the notion of the eon in Platonic time, and it surrounds time, i.e. it's a wider kind of receptacle or frame than time. It is the being of the heavens with time, and it is and time is in that being because it issues from the motion of the heavens, which exactly is what we were hearing earlier. Within this kind of ontological frame, it reflects the relationship of things which are immutable with those which are mutable. Although one's imagination, i.e. the human imagination, cannot directly grasp it because it sees everything in time and things that everything is, will be, and was. So basically that our experience of the world is tensed, and it's quite difficult for us to conceptualize of things which are not tensed or beyond that, past, present, and future, and sees everything as a when, either in the past or the present and the future. And then the third level, or perhaps the highest level, is that in which it is only the realm of the immutables, and this is called eternity. And again, it surrounds perpetuity. It's a broader, intelligible ontological level than perpetuity or the eon. So, and of course, for someone like Avicenna, this is basically the level of the divine, of the one. And then again, to establish the hierarchy, he then says perpetuity is conscious of time because it surrounds it, because time is below it. And time with respect to perpetuity, and certainly with respect to eternity, is a weaker existence because it is a flux and it is mutable. So you have a certain ontological hierarchy which is being set up alongside a sort of a temporal hierarchy, so to speak. Now the reason why I've started with this quotation is because it's taken from the perspective of how the human mind perceives these things, but also because in later discussions, it becomes a key way of trying to make sense of this relationship between time and creation. So the classic kind of problems then become at which one of these, say, three ontological temporal levels does creation cosmogony take place? Is it at the level of eternity? Is it at the level of time? Or is it at this median level of perpetuity? And I'm not going to go into the details of that because in a sense, I don't really want to talk about time and creation, and I believe you already had a whole session on creation, so it's probably not useful to discuss, to come back to that. This question of time and creation is an extensive and kind of ongoing debate within Islamic thought, precisely because it becomes a major issue of theological contention. Because you have this sort of debate between theologians who are trying to defend or save the appearance of scriptural accounts which seem to talk about creation in time, as opposed to philosophers who tend to deny it for the obvious reason, because it raises the question of, well, when does creation happen? At what point is that the case? And if time is something real, then when was a point before that creation, and so forth. So if that sort of regress of actual points of time is not possible, you can sometimes come up with other alternatives, such as imaginary time, which is one way that theologians try to deal with this question of creation in time. Now, as I said, I didn't want to dwell much on that. What I thought would be useful was just to raise a couple of other conceptions, a Sufi conception, an Ismaili Shia conception, and then come back to Mullah Sadra. I think the Sufi conception is quite important because, again, it relates to an assumption about the nature of existence as well. So one of the classic concepts which arises in a lot of medieval Sufi thought is the idea of a presentist approach to the Sufi, to the person. The person is in the eternal now, and everything that you do is in that eternal now. At the same time, there is a recognition that one has a different kind of being which relates to a broader frame of reality. So, for example, there's this constant kind of evocation of a prehistorical existence, a kind of existence of souls before bodies, or souls but even before the creation of the cosmos, and that those particular souls had been informed by God about what would arise and what would happen, including their particular end in the afterlife. And so in a lot of Sufi texts, you have this kind of recourse to saying that alongside our presentist existence, you have this constant recollection of the past, as well as the constant kind of looking to a prehistorical past, as well as a constant looking forward to an eternal future in the afterlife. And in those senses, it both kind of seems to break down any sense that there is a realistic conception of time. Alongside that, amongst the Sufis, particularly of the school of Ibn Arabi, who are basically existential monists, time again is not terribly meaningful in any sense of sequence, of change, of taking on of different states, precisely because that's also not the nature of existence. So if existence is somewhat unchanging, its appearances may differ. Similarly, there is the shift of the appearance of time, but in and of itself, it is unchanging. So in that sense, time is also somewhat devoid of meaning. And I would certainly argue that for most Sufi thinkers, it is precisely this kind of unreality of time which is significant, precisely because human bodies in and of themselves are not real entities either. They're mere kind of appearances of an unchanging being. Now, one other conception which I think is interesting, precisely because of the time as a linear kind of progression is the notion of cyclical time. And cyclical time is usually discussed in an Islamic context with respect to Ismaili thought from about the 9th century onwards. This is partly done through the distinction between time as a sort of a measure, as a number, as was discussed before, versus unmeasured time, which is eternity. But to say that ultimately the unreality of time means that things, in a sense, can repeat and come again, both going into the past and also moving to the future. Sometimes this is done in text by talking about specific kinds of miraculous events, about, for example, turning back the course of the sun to change the day, turning back the cycles of the moon to change the night, the month, as well as the opposite direction as well. And I think one of the reasons why cyclical time becomes significant is because of the way in which ideas around the appearance of the divine in the world is understood. So this is particularly the Shia concept of the imam, or a leader who is divinely appointed, who is kind of the face of God on earth. And ultimately it's the imam, the prophets before them, who define time, who define history. And so they act then in this way of expressing the divine will by determining what the nature of the natural as well as the metaphysical universe is. Now, I want to just say a couple of things about Mullah Sadra, who is the 17th century figure who I've worked on primarily. And one of, there are a number of issues which are worth pointing out. One is coming back, for example, to the question of time and creation. It then again allows us to really think about how we have multiple conceptions of time being used alongside each other. So when he kind of wades into this issue of where the creation exists, where the creation comes about at the level, as an eternal process, or whether it's in time, he comes up with this idea that it's both. So it's eternal precisely because there is something in the fundamental nature of being, and ultimately the being of the divine, that overflows and produces a cosmos. At the same time, it is also in time with respect to the way in which the individual mind, the individual person perceives change and reality around it, and also in the way in which things come to be engendered and to be created within the cosmos. So he tries to do that in these two ways, precisely because, in a sense, he has two conceptions of time as well as two conceptions of creation working side by side. And in a sense, the reason why he does that is because of a conception of existence that he has, which is increasingly, I think it's nowadays becoming standard to talk about it as modulation. So modulation of being is the idea that being or existence is a singular reality, but is modulated at different degrees and at levels. So by doing that, you can conceive of different concepts and different realities as having different degrees within a hierarchy with respect to common core features, but also being distinguished by intensity. And another thing, which of course he does that to develop the relationship with existence, is in other works he discusses the distinction between discussing time with respect to physics. So the classic Avicennian Aristotelian idea that time is a number, is a measure or a measure of motion, as well as a metaphysical idea. So time as a metaphysical idea is both the sort of broad notion of time as an image which comes out, arises out of, as he puts it, the world soul, a feature of the world soul, but also time as the way in which we make sense of different sorts of sequences within the world, within ourselves. The issue of aging that was mentioned earlier, that's precisely one of the examples he gives about the reality of time as we experience it as well. And clearly for him, this sort of reality of time is precisely associated with a metaphysical conception of what time is. So I think I'll try and just wrap up there by basically saying that what I really wanted to do is to say that there are a number of continuities with what's been discussed before about the inheritance of different conceptions coming out of late Neoplatonism in particular. There are, of course, historical relationships there as well. And there is the distinction between looking at time with respect to physics, with respect to the metaphysics, but also, as I said right at the beginning, really trying to think about how we conceive of time now with respect to frames such as progress, such as modernity, such as sequences of almost teleological sequences of coming to some sort of culmination and end. And I think I should probably stop at that point. Thank you for